Hello and welcome back to the Dan Cave, and welcome to another video build series. So this is one that came about sadly as a result of Gary Pashley's sudden death a while back. So over at ISM we launched a memorial group build for Gary. So a lot of people are doing F-15s, a few people are doing other subjects, but me personally, I'm doing the F-15. It was Gary's favourite aircraft, and as a tribute to him, I'm going to build the Great Wall Hobbies 72nd scale F-15E. So this is part one of the video, which actually covers quite a lot. So it'll probably only be two parts in total. So today's first part covers kind of all the basic construction, getting the cockpit done, get everything assembled, prime, paint and decal, and that's where we'll leave it at the end of the video. So so Great Wall Hobbies, relatively new entrant to the modelling world. I've built two of their 144th scale V bombers over the last year and a half. Found their kit's very good. High expectations for this from Great Wall Hobbies. Looking in the box, looked fantastic. So all in all, yeah, I'm quite looking forward to this build. So if you've not been here before, of course, don't forget to subscribe. If you like the video, don't forget to pop a like, and if you want to leave any comments, feel free as well. So no point me hanging around anymore. Let's get on over to the bench and see how this Great Wall Hobbies F-15 has gone together. So over we go. I'll be back at the end for some final thoughts. Off we go. So this is the box. So this is the Great Wall Hobbies 72nd scale F-15E. So there's been a couple of boxings of this from Great Wall Hobbies. I've got this particular boxing, and it is absolutely jam-packed with sprues full of plastic, and it looks really good. So as with most most aircraft actually, obvious starting place is the cockpit. So each of the seats come in a number of different parts. There's kind of a cockpit tub for a front and rear seat, separate instrument panels, etc. So that's where the build will start, by getting those kind of key components off the sprue, and literally just can start by gluing those seats together. So it's three separate parts, kind of two side pieces, and then a main central piece. Actually, I think there's four pieces per seat. So a little bit of a Tamiya extra thin. It's the glue of choice for this, because that will just run down any of the joins between them. Capillary action will just pull that extra thin along. A little bit of a squeeze, and they'll glue together absolutely fine. There is a tiny little bit of a visible seam line at the top of the seat, which I do address a little bit later using a little bit of CA glue, just to minimize its look and effect on the overall build. Because it is on a kind of prominent visible part. I think I'm going to have the canopy open on this kit, so it's worth just giving that a little bit of attention. So once that's done, the two kind of forward fuselage halves, so that'll make up the two side pieces for the cockpit, and inside that there'll be the interior tub and also the nose gear bay as well. So usual little bit of clean up the sprue attachment points, a little bit of a swipe with a sander as well, just to blend them in a little bit. In this case, I'm just using a sanding sponge. So, Because I'm sat at the bench, I get a little bit distracted, so kind of cockpit parts have been cleaned up and prepped, so I decide to crack on with some of the wing sections, because they can be done completely independently of the cockpit, because the entire forward section comes separately. So there's two lower wing pieces. There's the upper wing, complete wing section, tip to tip, and then there's a couple of intake covers which get glued in to the top of that. And they pretty much sit flush with the top surface. So I'm just using a cocktail stick just to kind of push them down and make sure they're actually seated correctly. And if done correctly, that should just leave a seam line on the top. So the two wing sections can basically be glued in straight away. So there's little mounting stubs all the way around the top wing section and the bottom wing section. So I'm just using a little bit of tube glue because it's much slower drying, just to add to those pieces, and that'll give that initial bind. Get them all lined up, press them into place. And then I'm just going to run some extra thin fast setting around the exterior join line. And the combination of both those glues should give you a really good strong join between them. So that can be run along the seam line at the leading and trailing edges also. So there is a tiny little bit of a gap, but that'll be dealt with later with some filler. Again, can just run that Tamiya extra thin into the rear part of the seam line as well. So a bit of a squeeze. The fast setting does seem to react quite well to the Great Wall Hobbies plastic. You do get a little bit of a kind of molten line up here, and that's just perfect for those seam lines. So keep running it all the way around. Bit of a squeeze together. The fast setting is exactly what it says. It is quite fast setting. But obviously those locating pins, having used some tube glue, they'll take a little bit longer to set. And basically for the opposite wing, it's basically the same process again. Set them in place, set the wings in place, get everything lined up. The little bit of tube glue will bind the locating pins together, and then use some of the extra thin quick setting to run around the rest of the seam lines. So for some reason during this build, I do seem to jump around a bit, so you might have to bear with me. It does all come together in the end, but there is a little bit of jumping around. So obviously we've done a bit of cockpit prep, now doing some of the wings, and now I jump back to the cockpit. So we've got Vallejo Model Air. Can't remember if that's good. I think that's gold grey. And that's the interior color for the cockpit tub. Also use that for the side walls as well of the interior. So no need to prime. Just a quick blast of that just to lay down a grey color. And then I can add the decals for the instrument panels. So there's individual decals for the main instrument panels, and then there's separate decals for the side consoles as well. So just using a little bit of water on the cutting mat, just let that sit for a few minutes, and the decals will lift straight off the backing sheet. Then we can carefully put them in place, make sure they're perfectly lined up. And then there's a bottom section as well. Again, they are a little bit oversized, but a little bit of UMP strong decal solution will sort them absolutely fine. That'll just help them conform onto the panel and over any of the switches and screens that are on it. Similar approach for the side consoles. Just get the decal in place, get it lined up where you need it, and then use the decal solutions just to well, basically melt those parts into place, melt those decals. So as you can see, you've now got all 4 of those decals on. They'll be left to sit for a while with the extra strong. And as you can see, all those decals have conformed absolutely perfectly to the panels. So just using cotton bud to dab up any excess decal solution. So the seats themselves, the seats have been given a quick coat of black paint. The seat cushions getting detailed in some kind of Revell Aqua green. Not sure which green I've used, but a suitable kind of dark green color. To be honest, on this kind of stuff, I'm not too worried about being exactly correct. Seat cushions take a lot of wear and tear and will weather and fade accordingly. There's a couple of little detail spots to pick out, a couple of brighter colors. Of course, this just adds to that kind of visual effect of something in this scale. There's a tiny little bit of kind of seat belt material on the seat back. It is very, very minimal. And to be honest, I just kind of think, well, that looks a little bit naff. I'm just going to make some very simple seatbelt harnesses using some, well, cheap store masking tape. It's a very thin strips. Just cut it to some appropriate lengths. And then just kind of burnish it down a little bit. And then I'm going over it with a kind of medium to dark grey color as well. Just to match kind of reference pics that I've seen. So it just gives a suitable contrast from the seat material, but hopefully kind of make sure they don't quite look like just strips of masking tape. So for all the kind of cockpit tub, because it's in a grey color, I'm going to use an ammo enamel wash. I think I'm using Starship Filth, and that'll just give a little bit of depth to the cockpit area. I'm not really trying to make it look dirty and used, just using the panel liner just to give a little bit of depth to some of the recessed detail in around the cockpit. So because it's not a gloss finish, I am kind of brushing it on because it doesn't quite flow as well on the over the Vallejo model layer. It's quite a matte finish. So there is quite a bit kind of going down, but all of that will clean up with a cotton bud with some odorless mineral spirits on it. So you're just kind of wiping off the excess, and that helps give a lot of kind of color tone variation as well. Certainly enough for 70-second scale, as this is. So I've got some light grey paint with a wide kind of flat brush. I'm going to use that to dry brush some of the seat, well, both of the seats. Again, that flat black can be very kind of one-dimensional looking in that scale. So a little bit of a dry brushing with light grey just helps pick out the kind of edges, some of the detail, etc. And overall, it just kind of gives a better visual kind of tone to a 70-second scale seat. So really, it's just a tiny amount of paint on the brush. You're removing most of the excess on the kitchen roll that I've got in front of me. And then as you brush it over the seat, you will kind of see that kind of the edges will get slowly picked up by a little bit of light grey. So once all of that is done and set, just using a little bit of CA glue to pop the control column in place, pop straight in, and pop the seat into place. So there's a front and rear seat because this is a Strike Eagle, so it's got 2 crew members. Then the instrument panel can go in. That'll be front and rear. And then there's basically kind of a shroud that sits over the rear instrument panel. So again, a little bit of CA glue. Get the part lined up where it needs to go. A little bit of manipulation, make sure it's in the right place, and that's all good. So there's really kind of positive locating points for a cockpit tub, 2 kind of pins on either side of the interior tub, matched with some receptacles on the side wall of the fuselage. So just using a little bit of tube glue to pop them in place. Make sure that all wraps around the cockpit. Make sure everything is aligned centrally as well. And then there's the kind of forward bulkhead, which is where the radar antenna will be sat. So I'm going to leave the nose open on this kit. Again, just adds a little bit of kind of visual interest, for want of a better term. And that just pops in place like that. And then once again, use the use the Tamiya extra thin quick setting adhesive. Just run that into the seam lines, and that will basically secure everything together. So the nose gear bay, which sits in the underside, which slots in, that's a little bit of a tight fit. So I'm just scraping away some of the plastic just to basically give me a little bit more clearance. And that should hopefully sit in a lot closer and a lot more flush, which it appears to do. And once again, a little bit of Tamiya extra thin. And that will all sit nicely in place. So it's back to the main part of the fuselage. The intake trunking has been added already. So that's been given a coat of white paint on the interior as well. And then there's the bottom fuselage section, which sits over that. And included in that section as well is the conformal tanks, which run all the way along the kind of engine intake trunking on the F-15. So once again, using a little bit of kind of standard tube glue. Just dropping some of that into the locating holes. Get that kind of bottom fuselage all lined up against those holes. Pop them in place. Once I'm happy with its kind of orientation and location, I can basically start kind of squeezing the rest of it together, make sure it all lines up correctly. And then, of course, once I'm happy with that alignment, there is a little bit of a gap, but I think a little bit of a squeeze on that should hopefully close that gap up. So again, using some Tamiya extra thin, just run that into the seam line. You want to run that basically all the way around. Maybe just kind of do one side first. Get that squeezed together, and that will dry very, very quickly and will kind of grab very, very quickly on the plastic. As you can see, that gap has pretty much disappeared already. Run again Tamiya extra along the kind of underwing root area, and then along the forward section as well. So as you can see, I've basically done one side. So that'll all get neatly kind of sealed together quite quickly. Once I'm happy that's reasonably secure, I can then progress on to the opposite side. So just holding it together, giving it a good kind of 30 seconds. It looks like I've frozen. I've not. I'm just holding it in place. So once you do the other side, of course, you can use some just some close pegs. Basically use them as a clamp, hold those parts together and give them a chance to cure fully. Because although the extra thin does grab very quickly, it doesn't cure completely as quicker than regular extra thin, but still needs some curing time. So once that's all nicely cured, I can then add in the forward parts of the intakes. Now, I have chosen to use the in-flight intakes rather than the drooped forward on ground ones, mainly because I just like the look of the in-flight ones. I think the on-ground, slightly nose-down attitude from the intakes just takes away a little bit from how the kit looks. So I'm quite happy to stick with the in-flight ones. So again, they go together absolutely no problem. There is a little bit of a seam line to be addressed, but that's not a big issue. So then there's two little parts which mount on basically on those kind of shoulders, one where the gun is mounted. So there is locating tabs on these, but that actually fails them and makes them more difficult to fit. So basically decided to remove them, and that actually makes them fit a lot better. So now that they're removed, they just slot in absolutely perfectly. But there is a tiny little bit of flash just on the inside, which when you remove that, just clean that up a little bit and it sits perfectly flush. So once again, a little bit of Tamiya extra thin quick drying. Just run that around, press them into place, and it fits absolutely fine. And then do exactly the same on the other side. Remove the locating pin. It actually makes it more difficult to fit the parts, in my view, and they sit a lot more flush. So once all those parts have had a little bit of curing time, we can go back and use some UMP sanders just to clean up any remaining kind of seam lines that we have. And yes, my head is in the way once again. So we can also clean up all of the kind of seam lines around the fuselage as well, top of the intakes. It's not that noticeable, but there is a little bit of a seam line. And my head's in the way again. But they do clean up quite quickly and quite easily. So where that gun is mounted, there is a tiny little bit of a seam line. I think it's better than some people have had with fitting these particular parts. It is quite a prominent location as well, so it is important to try and get as good a join line as possible, because it's a rather obvious area. So once I'm happy with all that cleanup, I'm using a little bit of Vallejo putty, which is a water-based putty, and it's got a consistency of kind of like decorator's caulk. Seems to have similar behavior. It does shrink a lot, but for the like of a seam line on the underwing where it's kind of difficult to get to, just run it in and use a moist cotton bud to remove any excess, and then you should be left with, albeit when it dries, a slightly shrunken back filled line. It is still a lot better and a lot easier to do it this way than to fill it using, a solvent-based filler, where there'll be a lot of sanding involved. And, it's not going to be as visible in areas, so not too much of a big deal. Certainly for the like of the kind of wing root join like this is the perfect use for this type of putty. Just get a slightly pointed cotton bud in this case and just remove any excess like so. And in the words of Mr. Bretland, there was no licking of any cotton buds whatsoever. Yeah, so once I'm happy with all that, it's a quick test fit of the forward fuselage. Seems to sit in quite nicely. It's not a perfect join. I do fill it a little bit, but I probably could have done a bit more work on it. It is a little bit more prominent than I want it to be, but it's not too bad. Once again, a little bit of Tamiya extra thin, just run that into seam line, and that will give you as much security as you need. It's got a good positive kind of locating for the forward nose section, but a little bit of manipulation is required just to get it to sit in the best position. As you can see, there is a little bit of a noticeable seam line. So with that in place, can now crack on and add the vertical fins. There's quite a bit of slop in their positioning. I've seen better, more positive locating kind of arrangements before. Again, extra thin use on both sides. Just run it into seam line. Give that a few minutes to kind of start to cure. They'll still be manipulatable, if that's a word. And then basically using good old Mark 1 eyeball to make sure they're as lined up as I want them to be. They look pretty good to my eye. So then there's a few more parts that need to be added. So you've got the flaps, so I'm going to put them in a slightly downward position. Tamiya extra thin, again, the adhesive of choice in this case. And then same for the other side. There's a little bit of a cleanup just to get them kind of as close fitting as possible, but it is very minimal, just a couple of swipes of a sander. And then same treatment for the ailerons. So these are in their neutral position. Flaps are in a slightly downward position. Horizontal tail planes, there's basically a pivot kind of mount for them. Again, there's a little bit of a slop in it, so a little bit of kind of Mark 1 eyeball to get them lined up will be necessary by using some extra thin, pop them in place, do the same on the opposite side. And that is pretty much all the airframe put together. There are some smaller pieces to be added, some aerials, etc., but that's the majority of the airframe now complete. So with that done, I've added the forward section of the canopy. I'm now going to mask up the rear section. That'll be temporarily tacked in place with some PVA glue because I'm going to leave that open when I go on to the later section of the build. But it's a good way to cover up the cockpit for painting, and it gets the framing kind of nicely matched in with the rest of the kit. So using some very thin AZU tape, basically to run around the edge of the framing. Makes it a lot easier to mask. Once the edges are done, and just kind of block it all out using larger pieces of Tamiya tape. So you just got to work your way around, fill in all the bits you want masked. Just keep cutting small sections of tape as required. So once this is done, it's over to the spray booth and can start the priming process and the painting process. So I'm going to speed up all this footage because it's just me priming and painting. So I'm using UMP grey primer as the base, and then using Vallejo gunship grey, which I'm basically adding some white to in various stages, and that'll introduce some kind of total variation to the grey as well. So it's not a monotone gunship grey. So let's play a little bit of music, sit back, relax, and watch what happens. So once I've got it painted and cured, it's time to start masking up for the exhaust areas. So they're quite large on the F-15. Once again, I'm going to kind of block it out using some very thin azu tape, and then fill in the rest of the areas using some different widths of Tamiya masking tape. So I do find that the more difficult bit is getting that kind of very kind of precise outline done first. Once that's done, the kind of blocking out stage is relatively easy. The only difficult bits are making sure that you get those edges sealed down properly. Make sure you don't get any kind of overspray through any gaps in the masking tape. So there is quite a large section of metallic on this. So I'm going to use jet exhaust set from Ammo, using some of the colors in that set. Stuff like stainless steel, polished metal, burnt iron. But use it in a kind of couple of different ways. So that's not shown on video. So here I'm just finishing the masking. Kind of last little sections being blocked out. Have to do the same on the top as well. kind of same process, and now I'm finishing the kind of blocking it all out sufficiently. Of course, I'm detacking the tape on my hand. That just helps kind of reduce the risk of kind of lifting any paint when you remove the masking tape. So again, just that action of making sure that's all sealed down around the edges, and I make sure there's no overspray getting through. Yep, that's all looking pretty buttoned up. And as if by magic, I'm back from the spray booth and it's all done. So as I said, I've used a mixture of different kind of colors from the ammo jet engine set. They're acrylic paints. They're all right. They're not brilliant. Not my favorite, but there's a nice kind of selection of colors in there just to give a nice metallic effect. Although the pigments are pretty big. Not as good as kind of lacquer pigments, but I do prefer using acrylics for this kind of work. But that's all nice and good. All that masking tape can be removed. Obviously, gently remove it. All successfully removed. No issues with any paint being removed. And with that all done, we've got a fully painted airframe. And it's basically time to get on with the decals. Now, as you can see, there are some kind of big sections of clear decal. The way they've structured the decal sheet is not brilliant. They've mixed in a lot of the kind of decals and stencils together. But we'll see how we get on. So once again, I'm going to speed this all up so you can sit back and listen to some music while I decal this kit. So that's it. That's the decals done. And that's basically part one complete. So as you can see, that there's a lot of shiny decals. There's a lot of decal film. That's something that will need to be addressed in part two. Probably will attack them with some extra strong decal solution once they've set for a while. But we'll definitely need a clear coat to try and tone down the shininess, and hopefully they'll blend in with the rest of the paint once that's done. So that's it for part one. Let's head back over to me for a few final thoughts. So there we go. That is the first part of the F-15 video build. As you can see, I think it's gone together pretty well. I think the major letdown for me was the decals. I think they were poor. They were really poor. I think the decals on the V bombers that I did were better. So I don't know where, what's changed in between some of the kits have done. Certainly this was a much bigger sheet than on the V bombers, but the stuff like the stencil data on such big carrier film and very glossy and very prominent. I mean, as you saw at the end of the video, they kind of stand out a mile. Now, what I didn't cover in the video is I did go back and kind of attack those areas with some UMP extra strong, a little bit of a slice through the decals and put some extra strong on it. So that has improved the look of them. But until, I think it definitely needs some kind of clear coat over it just to see how they look with, say, a semi-gloss or a satin clear coat over it, see if it dulls them down and makes them a little bit less obvious. Hopefully so, because then it won't detract from the build. I think if they stay as prominent as they are, that's a bit of a not happy kind of finish. I'm not going to go to the extent of kind of stripping it back. I'll do what I can with the decals, see how the clear coat covers them in part two, maybe attack them again with some extra strong again, see if we can do something about them. But for the moment, we're leaving it as it is until we get on with part two. So you'll have to wait and see and come back for part two and see how I get on with that. So yes, as you can see, part one has covered a lot. I don't think I had the construction issues other people have had. I mean, I've used a little bit of filler, mainly on some seam lines. Most of them are quite well hidden, so not too worried about nothing prominent on the upper side. So I was quite happy with that overall construction of the kit. Paint went okay. I think could have had a little bit more variation in the tone on the colour, but hopefully that the weathering stage will address some of that by kind of introducing some kind of washes. Don't know if I'm going to go the enamel or water-based route. Have some pigments, could add some pigments to it. I do have some oils as well, could add some oils as well. Not really decided how I'm going to approach the weathering as of yet. Yeah, that'll be covered in part two. Because literally the kit is exactly as it's finished right now, as you saw in a couple of minutes ago in the video. I've not touched it since, mainly because I wanted to get the video edited and get it out there before I progress on, because I've been a bit slow on the videos lately. But however, that's the state of the build so far. Obviously, if you've liked the video, please give it a like. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. It would be greatly appreciated. And of course, if you have any comments or questions, stick them in the chat below. So if not, I'll say thank you to those who've stayed this far and watched. Thank you to all my subscribers, of course. And I'll see you all in part two. So thank you very, very much for watching. And one last time, this is for Gary. So thank you all. We'll see you in part two. Bye bye.